I would say one thing about crowdsourcing on legislation, and that is that it can be very, very good, and it's terrific to solicit input. But is it always, should it always be determinative on constitutionally protected minority rights? What happens when you have crowdsourcing on voting rights or property rights that are exclusive and protected by the Constitution, which are there because you have one owner and an unlimited number of users? Do the users draft all of the rules for the use of the property? Or is the Constitution meant to protect the owner of the property because a direct democracy would mean a lack of protection because the owner is supposed to have the exclusive right and control of their property because it's theirs? And the users are not meant to be drafting the rules of the owner's property. The market is supposed to dictate whether or not that owner is successful in the rules they construct around their property, because if they're not flexible enough or they don't meet consumer demand, they'll suffer and they won't get a return on their investment. What about lots of other minority rights? Is crowdsourcing the best way to always, figure out whether or not pure majority input is the way to go? And will it be so determinative or so scary because of the reactions of an anonymous or a name and shame that all of a sudden Congress is willing to say, let's ease up on protecting those minority rights, even if they're constitutionally protected, because we have a danger of not getting reelected by people who might not feel that we should be the right representatives in our republic of those particular rights that were put there for a reason. So we just have to be careful. Now, I don't mean to sound over alarming here, because again, public input is by and large very, very positive. And it's not always completely determinative. It just sheds light on what people are thinking. But it's the public input combined with the funded campaign, the bumper sticker slogans, the corporate interests, that together can be used and harnessed in a manner that you have to be careful about where the results can go. And all of this has always been part of our democratic experiment. So it's not like there's one right or wrong answer here. There's always a balance. And the other thing I would say is that you have to be very careful about what you invest in and what you harness, because the same people who you quote unquote unleash with a bumper sticker or some misinformation aren't exactly loyal to you, the maybe original funder of the campaign. They can be just as equally against you on your next issue that revolves around some of the same pieces. So internet freedom as an agenda, for example, might translate on privacy issues to go against a company that's aggregating data and assembling profiles from lots of different pieces where they're making money by exploiting them. So usually these things sort of take care of themselves in our society, which is a good thing. And it'll always be combined with traditional grassroots pieces like robocalls. Part of this campaign were robocalls that were paid for, where, for example, somebody in a conservative Republican district would get a phone call and it would say, do you believe in internet freedom? Yes. Do you think that President Obama should be able to let his internet czar, buzzword, control the internet and take down any website he or she wants, buzzword? No. Then call your congressman.
They would say we're okay.
Exactly. She's excellent. But call your congressman. So it is a combination of factors put together and the influence that they have that I think are more determinative. And I do think members of Congress did view this a little bit as a postcard campaign. When Google put the shroud over Google and said, click here and send a message, the exact same message came. It's just that the difference is, instead of a postcard campaign, when you have 16 billion visits to your website a day and statistically 4.5 million click, and Congress has never received 4.5 million emails in a day and it's brand new, you have to ask yourself 10 years from now, will they say, oh, that's just 4.5 million clicks of the exact same message? 4.5 million clicks was new today. It's not going to be new tomorrow, just like the postcard campaigns sort of, had their day, and then people got used to them, and things adapt. So these things have a way of sort of, this was unique and it was first, but I do think that at the end of the day, the same balancing interests will sort of prevail to have it all work out.
But that's my point, is that we're seeing a shift away from the knee-jerk reaction, formatting emails, to people actually taking action in different ways. Each person having their own reason to call the congressman, and in some cases getting on the Madison Project to make specific actions that could be done to achieve the goals that there's broad consensus on. I think you raise a red herring about crowdsourcing. At the end of the day, the congressman or the executive agency that's drafting proposed legislation has the pen. And if the crowd says do something unconstitutional, they don't have to write that in there. I think what we're excited about with crowdsourcing is we can get away from the unintended consequences that sneak into some of this legislation. You mentioned DMCA as if it was a perfect piece of legislation, but there's a lot of really unintended consequences, and that's one of the reasons that people are really upset about this new SOPA legislation, because they saw that with DMCA, you have a small little porn company creating a $15,000 movie, which then gets downloaded thousands of times, generating $500,000 for the lawyers who sue the people who download the porn movie. It's a wonderful business model. That's not, it's not the big studios making money off these lawsuits. It's these little companies that are going after people who have a teenage son who downloads it. So there's a lot of unintended consequences that people are worried about, and crowdsourcing can help identify those early. But at the end of the day, that isn't going to, so we're not going to see this incredible, mob writing legislation on anything and everything. Instead, we're going to see the crowd taking the time to do some thoughtful analysis and identify places where there is ambiguity or there is the potential for unintended consequences. Another interesting crowdsourcing project is the White House We the People initiative. And the response that the White House gave on SOPA was in response to a petition. There's a new one, by the way, that says that Chris Dodd should be arrested for bribing congressmen. Apparently, this got the required number, and there was a response from the White House that's worth reading. Actually,
they actually did respond.
They did respond. They had to respond and said we don't talk about legal law enforcement actions, because there's a number of petitions on sue this person, sue that person, go after that person.
Okay.
I'd like to.
You'll wait.
I'd like to make a response about crowdsourcing. I think I totally agree with you. It can be the equivalent of a high-tech lynch mob, and it has to be used carefully. The U.S. government has used it actually twice that I know of, besides President Obama's initiative. It used it for patents. And so who was the crowd? In that case, the crowd was people who had an economic stake in determining the patent and were very knowledgeable about it. The other example was related to the AT&T T-Mobile merger. You're probably familiar with that example. I'm worried about it too, though, because I do think crowds get whipped into frenzies, and they can become a high-tech lynch mob. And I think this is happening to a great extent with this particular issue. I think people don't really understand what internet freedom means and what is a careful balance of their privacy rights, internet security, an open internet. And I think every culture is going to have to find its own balance. And the United States is out here trying to export a balance, but we haven't achieved our own balance. And that kind of worries me. So I hope that talks like these will lead more people to just think about it.
Yeah,
And,
how is folks using, the public using the internet to share their perspective in broad numbers any different than the folks like myself who have fancy offices on K Street going up to the Hill and advocating their perspective? I think outside of Washington, people perceive us as having outsized influence. And in fact, what I've observed is we spend a lot of time just talking to people about our perspective. And that gets a fancy name like lobbying. And so it seems really impactful and powerful. I don't think that we're going to see people we will see people hyperventilating, the ultimate impact of that, I think, will be akin to what happens in the lobbying process anyway. And from my perspective, that's a good thing, because we won't end up with, if folks who drove SOPA and PIPA had it to do over again, including Mitch, if he's willing to share with you, which I know that he is, because he shared with me, they would welcome the input that came from the crowd, and we would have had a better bill that had a chance of actually passing as a result of it. So from my perspective, I think it's all good. And Mitch raises a very good point, which is we're not always going to prevail, right? And so there are times, like on SOPA and PIPA, where it'll turn out in some senses in a way that's meaningful and helpful to one perspective, but on other issues it may not. And I think that's what our democracy was constructed to get to, right?
I think you're half right. This process that we saw with the grassroots lobby is like half of what goes on in K Street. I give my physicist's view of power in Washington to any visiting group of interns that come to visit. And I describe how there are 4 fundamental forces of nature, and there are 4 fundamental forces of Washington. The least important is policy. What's the right thing to do? Then there's politics. What gets me reelected? Oh, then there's party, excuse me. Then there's politics. And at the top is the personal. And that's the part that I think people are really upset about. That's what Jack Abramoff is selling in his book. The discussions, one of his most quoted lines is, once you tell a chief of staff on the Hill that you might have a position for them on K Street, they'll do whatever they want, whatever you want.
Yeah.
That's not, I mean, that's cynical, and it's not, obviously not true of everyone,
Yeah.
but that's the part that people are upset about.
But that's no, I mean, I think for the, and this is where Mitch is, I think one of the points that Mitch was making at the beginning is the personal has always been a part of it, because that's the reason on Thursday night, all of the members jumping their cabs and run to National Airport to get the heck out of town so they can reconnect with their constituents. And so I don't see that as a really dangerous change. I think the thing that all of these new platforms enable is for that personal connection to occur in a much broader way and a less secretive way, which I think is a net positive.